Today we unravel the enigma of John Quincy Adams, a man who navigated the turbulent waters of early American politics and stood against the tide of slavery, yet is often remembered for his lackluster presidency. How could a man who achieved so much, who lived under the immense shadow of his father John Adams, one of the most prominent founding fathers, have such a controversial and often criticized time in office? To explore these contradictions and Adams' intricate and complicated relationship with slavery, we are joined by Jeff Denman, author of John Quincy Adams, Reluctant Abolitionist, which will be linked in the description below. Enjoy the episode. Well, Jeff, welcome back to American History Gazette.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
This is a unprecedented, very special episode because this is the very first time that I have had a guest return to our show, so I'm very excited for this. But you are here today for your book, John Quincy Adams, Reluctant Abolitionist, which is your more recent work. And I'm curious as to what inspired you to write this, and how did you come to the subtitle Reluctant Abolitionist?
Well, I had read several biographies of Adams before I started thinking about a book. And it was interesting because in each of the biographies that I read, it talked mostly about his interactions with slavery during his congressional career. And I was always wondering, what happened during his formative years? What happened in the years before he joined Congress? And so I was very interested in, the progression of where he was early and what it was all the way up until his death.
Yeah, he's definitely an interesting character in American political history because he's achieved so much in his lifetime and he's experienced so much. I don't think there's ever been a politician that I can think of in U.S. history that had so much experience. But when you look at his presidency, he didn't really achieve much. He achieved a lot before his presidency and a lot after his presidency, but his presidency was very lackluster, and historians remember him as on the lower rankings of his presidency. But he's part of this new generation. It's kind of the first generation out of the founding fathers, and they had to, pave their own way and carry on the legacy of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. But I want to go back to his childhood because he was alive during the American Revolution as a child. He was the son of one of the most prominent figures in the colonies, John Adams, of course. But did witnessing the American Revolution as a child shape him in any way in his views?
Yes, it did, as a matter of fact. In the first year of the war, John Quincy kind of feared for the life of his father and worried that the British might take his family hostage. So with his father absent, he began, as the oldest boy, he began to feel responsible for protecting his mother. And actually, she took him up to the top of Penn's Hill, which is right where they used to live. And from there, they witnessed the Battle of Bunker Hill. So war became a kind of a frightening reality for Adams. He was experiencing the battles around Boston. Soldiers were marching on the road by his house. He was also reading his father's letters from Philadelphia about the struggle to declare independence, and it kind of brought things to the fore for him. He absorbed a lot of these early memories, and I think as he got older, he began to share his parents' feeling for this dedication to a new United States and to establish and consolidate a republic, and also to expand it as well.
Yeah, living in Boston, he was really in the hotbed of the revolution, especially in the early years of the war. His father, John Adams, was sent overseas to Paris and Amsterdam to meet with the Dutch, and he was sent on these diplomatic missions to help get funding for the American Revolution and eventually negotiate the Treaty of Paris. But he took John Quincy with him over to Europe during the Revolution to give him the experience of diplomacy and dealing with these foreign nations. How was that experience for John Quincy Adams, going to Europe as a child, watching his father, shadowing Benjamin Franklin, who was also over there? Did that shape him in any way?
It shaped him in multiple ways. The first way was that he spent so much time in Europe as a young man, and he was able to see more than any. By the time he was 21, he saw more than any other 21-year-old. I mean, he just experienced so many different things. And that perspective obviously helped him on later on in life. But when he gets to Europe, he becomes the translator for Francis Dana. In 1781, Francis Dana is named the minister to Russia, and the Russian court, in the Russian court, the language is not Russian; it's French. And so John Quincy, at the age of 14, is fluent in French, and he's going to. If you look at his background, he's either proficient, fluent, or pretty much working up to proficient in about 8 different languages. So it's incredible. So 14 years old, he is going to be the translator for Francis Dana. So he needs to go from France out to St. Petersburg, and it's about a 2,500-mile trip. But what he does is, as he goes along, he records in his diary what he sees. And so when he gets to Berlin, he makes note that Frederick the Great treated his subjects like slaves. When he gets to Poland, he notices that he writes in his diary that all the farmers are in the most abject slavery and they're bought and sold like beasts. When he gets to Russia, he writes, like, if the land is sold, the serf goes with it. So these scenes are very shocking to a young Adams, and he sees the degradation of human beings, and these scenes are sure to make an imprint on him. And so, his mother, which we can talk about later, his mother is a great influence on him. And she writes a letter to him, and it's one of my favorite quotes from Abigail Adams. And she reminds him to, I don't remember the exact quote, but I think it's something like, let your observations produce in your mind an abhorrence of domination and power, which is the parent of slavery, ignorance, and barbarism that places man upon the level with his fellow tenants of the woods. Just a brilliant quote. So he begins to see all these things, and he also notices like some of the different ethnicities and religious groups that are oppressed, and all of these things are things that will make an impression on him and probably influence him in his later life.
Reading the correspondence between Quincy Adams and his parents, it's quite evident and clear that they knew what they were doing. They were shaping him to become a leader in America, in the new United States. I know there's a quote from his father, John Adams, who said that if he does not learn from these experiences and become an expert and become the top 1% and eventually rise to the highest office in America, he will be a failure. It was something along the lines of that. So his parents knew what they were doing. But you talk about slavery in Europe. Was slavery an institution in Europe at that time? Because my understanding is at that point, the institution of slavery was pretty much rare throughout Europe. But you mentioned kind of the feudal state and how
it's mostly about the feudal state.
Some of the monarchies and dynasties in Europe were still treating their citizens like slaves.
Yes, that's exactly right. So that's basically what Adams is observing, and so so anyway, he is his mother, as you just mentioned, his mother becomes a really quite a force with him early on, and so his experiences back in Quincy too become very important too, because even though Massachusetts is not a great place to observe the institution of slavery, there are still instances going on that he and his mother correspond about that are very important in terms of him seeing what is going on here.
Interesting. Yeah, his mother was so instrumental in American history in general, and definitely in his life. I'd like to flesh out their relationship a little bit more. She wasn't, at that time, women were subject to housewives and roles beneath the men of society, but Abigail Adams kind of broke that boundary of society and asserted herself as a prominent figure in the colonies nevertheless. So how impactful and influential was his relationship with his mother when it comes to his views and his views on slavery?
I think that Abigail is a big influence. John is gone most of the time, and but both of them, both Abigail and John, both of them shared the same anti-slavery sentiment. Um, they never owned a slave, nor hired the slaves of others to work on their farm. Both felt that slavery was incongruous with the revolution, and her actions and her letters back this up. For instance, when Abigail sailed to Europe with her daughter Nabby to meet John in 1784, Abigail left a black woman in charge of the house while she was gone, and she showed little concern about the arrangement at all. And when she's in London in 1786, she writes John Quincy a letter, and she happens to be seated next to this wealthy South Carolina planter who owns like 1,500 human beings. And she writes a letter to him, and she says something about the fact that she can't stand sitting next to this guy because he owns 1,500 human beings. And she calls it a disgrace to humanity. And so, John Quincy is certainly getting a lot from his mom. And then there's another great anecdote she has, that they have a servant, James, who wants to attend this evening school, but Abigail is informed that if James goes to the school, it's going to break up the school for the other kids. So there's no moss under her feet. So she goes right after the schoolmaster, and she starts probing at his principles. And she tells the schoolmaster, "Fine, I'll just take him into my parlor and I'll teach him how to read or write." So it's very, very interesting. And the other thing too, Jake, I think, which is interesting here, talking about the Adamses and where they fell along their feelings about race and things like that, is, for their time they were pretty liberal about the subject. But Abigail, John Quincy, they certainly had their limits. And there's a great instance here which I think is worth talking about, because you get a sense of where Abigail drew the line. So in 1785, she's in London, and she's going to see Shakespeare's play, tragedy Othello. Just in case people don't know what Othello is. So the key character is Desdemona, and she's this Venetian beauty, and she elopes with Othello, who happens to be a person of color, and he's a general in the Venetian army. So he eventually kills her and then kills himself, and that's the general gist of the story. But the most important part is when Abigail sees this play, she's appalled, and her prejudice is very easy to see. And she writes to her son-in-law after she sees it, and she is just completely appalled that this person of color was actually married to Desdemona. And what she does in her letter, she talks about, well, he must have used spells and magic to win her affections. And John Quincy saw the play in 1835, and he is just totally disgusted. And Desdemona, he writes, Desdemona was like a victim of a treacherous and artful intriguer. That's what John Quincy says. So you can see the line where Abigail draws it. It goes right up to the mixing of races, and that's where it stops. So it's an interesting anecdote to see where this all falls along with John Quincy and Abigail.
That's very interesting. So even though they were opponents of the institution of slavery, they still were pro-segregation and against the mixing of races. So they still were subject to the societal constructs of that time, it seems.
Right, right. So they were basically saying that if you mixed the races, it would shatter it would shatter nature's own codes. That's the way they were looking at it. So it's just a very interesting view into how they felt about things. Slavery was wrong. It was morally wrong. It should be eliminated. There's no question about it, but then it kind of stops. And oh, the other thing too, Jake, which is interesting, later on, she kind of chides herself and she writes another letter and she says that um, she's really disappointed in herself and she chides herself for being like illiberal in her thoughts. And she's working it out, trying to figure out why she feels the way she does. So she's very introspective, very interesting character, one of my favorites.
Yeah, Abigail and John the father, they were definitely very two fiery, animated individuals. But it's interesting that you mentioned earlier John Adams and John Quincy Adams were actually the only two of the first dozen or so presidents who actually didn't own slaves, which I think is an important point to make. After his experience with the revolution, his father negotiates the Treaty of Paris. He goes back to America, goes to Harvard for a law degree, and his experience in Europe and being the son of Adams has no doubt given him very much notoriety and credibility in the political sphere and arena. And President Madison appoints him as minister to Britain during the War of 1812. So he's minister to Britain, and it's while he's in Britain, I'm pretty sure he's in London, that he meets his wife, Louisa. So can you walk me through his marriage to Louisa? Because from my understanding and my research, he wasn't necessarily happy with this marriage. They spent a lot of time apart. They could go weeks or months without seeing each other. And I know he was a man who suffered from severe depression. He wasn't necessarily a pleasant person to be around. So just walk me through his marriage to Louisa and maybe how this contributed to his personal misery.
Well, I would say that overall their marriage was difficult. It had its ups and downs for sure. He was a very sharp-tempered kind of guy, domineering for sure, hard to get along with. Louisa was quite a bit the opposite. She was very charming. She had this love of society. She had a desire to please people, but she also could be moody. She suffered from, I think she suffered from severe depression and was also a bit of a hypochondriac as well. So they frequently exasperated each other. And Louisa actually writes that, on a lot of things, we really don't, see eye to eye. So they would get along for the most part, and then they would kind of descend into arguments and they would be annoyed at each other. And, you know, if she questioned his judgment, he would bristle. Or if she offered opinions that differed from his own, he would bristle. And, in 1824, when he's run, just to jump ahead a little bit, because this is about Louisa, while the campaign was going on for president, she would be discussing current affairs with congressmen and journalists. She'd be lobbying them for support. She'd make frequent social calls on wives, entertained Washington society at elaborate dinners. She was doing all this. She was becoming one of the leading ladies of Washington society. But after Adams wins the election, he basically ignores her counsel and only used it when it was convenient for him. So that's kind of like gives you a little summary of what went on. But they also, too, and it's important to know, they suffered a lot of grief. And they lost 3 children. They lost their daughter when they were in St. Petersburg. They lost their daughter at 15 months. One son died of suicide. The other son died of acute alcoholism. And so clearly that's going to be a very important factor on what goes on in their relationship.
Yeah, those instances, no doubt, probably contributed to his severe depression and his unlikability as a character. But while he's in Britain, as minister to Britain. He negotiates the Treaty of Ghent, which signs the treaty that concludes the War of 1812. So, how did he navigate the Treaty of Ghent, especially when it came to issues such as slavery?
Yeah, this is a very interesting thing. So, one of the big problems, just to give some context to this, one of the biggest problems of the time was the seizure of American merchant vessels by Britain, and this caused huge problems between Britain and the United States. So Adams is very concerned about the issue of impressment of American sailors prior to and during the war. So, the British would come up to American ships and take sailors off and impress them into the army. They'd go onto the docks in taverns, drag people out, impress them into the Navy. And so this became a huge issue between Britain and the United States. But it's his position on returning slaves back to their owners that was the most troubling, given the anti-slavery background of his family. So in his diary, he writes a lot about what's going on. And in his diary, he notes that he and his English counterpart had discussed the return of captive slaves to their rightful owners. And Adams writes in his diary, he says that our object as the United States was the restoration of all property, and that includes slaves, and they ought not to have been taken. And all private property on shore was of that description, and slaves are private property, so they're property and they should be returned. So that's kind of an interesting statement by him, given the nature of the family history. So Adams spends years discussing this issue with his British counterparts, but there's no agreement in the near future that's reached. And although the British made several offers to stem slavery and the slave trade, Adams is intractable on this issue. So up to this point in time, Adams's approach to slavery is kind of a puzzle, despite his family's anti-slavery position. So for Adams, the impressment issue far outweighed any slavery concerns. So to Adams, anti-slavery is relegated to an inferior position when Britain asserts its muscle on the high seas. So that's how he's kind of dealing with slavery at this time.
Was that a form of compromise for him when negotiating the treaty to get better terms, or was this his own view and something that he brought to the table?
Well, remember he's dealing with he has to carry out the concerns of the president. So this is something that that he is he's doing. I wouldn't say it's all his part, but this is how he is feeling at the time. So so this is something that needs to be taken care of. And in this particular instance, taking care of the situation with Britain, it puts slavery in the back seat for the time being.
So it's something that he brought to the table, but he did it on behalf of the president and on behalf of the United States, not from his own personal opinions or beliefs.
Right.
Something that I would like to touch on after all of this is through, he's in the United States. He switches his allegiance to the Democratic Republicans, which is interesting to me because his father was one of the most prominent and early Federalists, which is the opposing party to the Democratic Republicans. So walk me through why he chose to switch his allegiance and how he came to that decision, because the Democratic Republicans were typically the party of the South and typically the party of the pro-slavery movement.
Well, they were actually both, because they broke up into factions. But let me walk you through this. So John Quincy's initially a member of the Federalist Party, but it wasn't for long. So he had policy disagreements. He found himself unpopular member. It's an unpopular party. And he does state in his diary, and he's pretty clear about this, and he does it a number of times, he never was a strict party man. And he considers himself a man of the whole country. And so in 1807, he is actually supports Jefferson's Embargo Act to stop all commerce with Britain. It hurts New England merchants and exporters, but he's not budging. So what happens is the Federalists are unhappy with him. He gets removed from his Senate seat in 1808, and then he allies himself with the Democratic Republicans. So the Missouri Compromise kind of sparks the first national slavery debate since the ratification of the Constitution. And what happens is that Congressman James Talmadge proposes an amendment providing for the exclusion of slavery from Missouri, and this immediately exposes fault lines in the party. So the Northern Democratic Republicans, they form a coalition with the remnants of the Federalist Party, while Southern Democratic Republicans are almost unanimously against any restrictions at all. So by the time of 1824, when the presidential election is waged, it's waged by all members of the Democratic Republican Party. So after the election, Jackson and his cronies morph it into the Democratic Party, and then John Quincy and Henry Clay form an opposition to Jackson. They form the National Republican Party, which then forms part of the Whig Party. So it's a very complicated thing. So that's kind of how it went down.
Yeah, it's a transformative era in politics at this time. And at this time, the position of Secretary of State is kind of seen as the successor to the president. It was sort of the precedent at that time because Madison was Jefferson's Secretary of State, and he succeeded Jefferson. Monroe was Madison's Secretary of State, who succeeded Madison. And under Monroe, Quincy Adams was the Secretary of State, who would obviously succeed Monroe. But while he's Secretary of State, it's here that the Missouri Compromise comes through, and I would just like to flesh out what exactly the Missouri Compromise was, because John Quincy Adams believed that it was the federal government's responsibility to stop the spread of slavery. Where there already was slavery was sort of seen as the states' rights and entrenched in a way. But one of the major topics at this time in American politics was westward expansion, especially after the Louisiana Purchase and all of this land to the west of the colonies, well, now the United States, that is uninhabited, and the question of slavery in these territories is up in the air. So Missouri is admitted as a state, and the question of slavery leads to the Missouri Compromise, which John Quincy Adams believed that they need to stop the spread of slavery and that slavery shouldn't be an institution in Missouri. So walk me through what exactly the Missouri Compromise was and why John Quincy Adams was ultimately overruled on this decision.
So the Missouri Compromise is when, well, first of all, to back up, it was important to have an equal number of slave states and free states in terms of representation in Congress. So they always strove to have an equal number. So when Missouri wants to come into the Union, this throws a monkey wrench into the formula. So Missouri wants to come in as a slave state, but if they do, it's going to shift the balance to the slave states. So a compromise is reached, and what's going to happen is that Maine is going to come in as a free state, Missouri will come in as a slave state, and the balance is restored. And from this point forward, there will be no slavery above 36 degrees 30 minutes, which is the southern border of Missouri. So that is the compromise that takes place. So the most important thing, well, there's two important things about this in terms of Adams. Adams is not really saying a whole lot about, in public, about slavery at this particular time. Even though all this is going on around him, he's still not making a public stand about slavery. So in his mind, he's kind of weighing these the coexisting factions of anti-slavery convictions, but yet his firm commitment to the idea of union, and he doesn't want anything to get in the way of holding on and maintaining the union. But one of the most important things in regards to slavery in this is that he puts a quote in his diary that's very, very prophetic. And so this goes all the way back to, I think it's 1820 or 21. But he says that the Declaration of Independence, what does it say, laid upon a precipice into which the slaveholding planters of his country sooner or later must fall. Very interesting statement. So, and by the way, there's two important documents Adams always refers to throughout his life. One is the Declaration and the other is the Constitution. So he also mentions that that the Missouri Compromise and the whole Missouri crisis is a mere preamble to a great tragic volume. So what Adams is foreseeing here is he's foreseeing that this issue, this anti-slavery slavery debate that's going on, unless this is resolved, Adams is actually correct here way back in 1820 when he says this is a mere preamble to a great tragic volume, because he's seeing that both sides are very, very entrenched in this issue.
Yeah, it's, in my opinion, it's here where the seeds of the Civil War are planted. And you're right, that's a very prophetic statement, because he's basically foreseeing the Civil War that would play out mainly over the issue of slavery. But fast forwarding to the election of 1824, this is personally my favorite aspect of Adams' presidency, because I think Andrew Jackson is a fascinating character, and that is his friction and his intense rivalry with Andrew Jackson that stems and begins from the election of 1824. It's a very heated four-way election. Andrew Jackson gets the popular vote, but he didn't get the majority enough of the Electoral College to be elected president, so the election goes to the House, and there's some speculation on election corruption and stealing the election here, because the House and Speaker of the House Henry Clay appoint Adams as president. So I'd like to talk about the election of 1824 here and that friction with Jackson, and I'd like to get your opinion on the election process and maybe some of the backroom deals that happened. Do you think that Adams partook in any sort of corruption with Henry Clay and cut a deal to get the election?
It's really hard. It's really hard to say, and I think people are kind of split on the issue. It's really hard to it's hard to make that determination. But in this particular situation, the Electoral College, after the votes, gives Jackson 99 votes. Adams comes in at 84 electoral votes, but unfortunately, nobody got a majority of votes. Jackson would need 32 more votes for a majority. So it goes to the House, okay? And now remember, Henry Clay at the time is a Speaker of the House, and so he's got some influence, and this is where this becomes murky. So Clay can guide things in a certain direction because of his influence as House Speaker. So once they vote Adams as president, and this is where things get suspicious, Adams then turns around and makes Clay his Secretary of State. So this is where Jackson just completely erupts. Okay, so he claims that there was a corrupt bargain made between Adams and Clay. And as a matter of fact, this is also an interesting part of this too. Clay believes that Jackson was not qualified to be president. Another interesting little piece in this little puzzle that nobody can really solve. And he certainly questioned Jackson's commitment to internal improvements, like John Quincy Adams would do. So Jackson resigns his Senate seat and he vows to win the presidency in 1828. So by the time 1828 comes, Jackson wins by a landslide. He wins 95 electoral votes, and he becomes the president. And Adams limps back to Quincy. So anyway, so that causes a massive amount of what's the word I'm looking for? Aggravation between those two. Now, later on, this is kind of funny, but not funny. So in 1833, Jackson is going to get an honorary degree from Harvard, which is Adams's alma mater. And you can only imagine what Adams felt about that. Adams, in his diary, calls it a disgrace. He calls Jackson. This is Adams's words. He's a barbarian who could not write a sentence of grammar and could hardly spell his name. So he does this throughout his diary about all different types of people. But that's the animosity between the two, because Jackson's a slaveholder. He owns probably about 150 slaves, and he's also at the point of the movement of Native Americans westward. So you can see that there is just no love lost here whatsoever.
Man, I absolutely love it. I love the controversy. I love getting into it. It's also here where we start to see presidential campaigns, because up until this point, it was sort of taboo to campaign for the presidency. It was seen as pandering to the voters, but because it was such a contentious election, really, it starts with Jackson. Adams still frowned upon this, but Jackson started campaigning and having rallies. And I know there was one instance that cracks me up. I believe it was in Philadelphia. I could be mistaken, but Adams was sleeping in a hotel or something, and not being planned. This is all coincidental, but right outside, Jackson was having a rally, and the chaos at the rally was actually keeping Adams awake. And I believe he wrote about his frustrations in his diary, which is just such a funny little anecdote to me. But Adams does get elected to the president by the House and Henry Clay. And I think this is where the controversy of stealing an election comes from, because like I mentioned earlier, it was a precedent that the Secretary of State would succeed the president. So I think Henry Clay cut a deal with Adams to give him the election in exchange for the Secretary of State position, thinking that he would succeed Adams. And I think that's where a lot of the conspiracies and the controversy comes from. But as president, Adams doesn't really achieve anything when we look back at it. I know he had some infrastructure plans, some domestic policy, but in the midterm elections of 1826, the Jacksonians really took over Congress. So Adams he had his hands tied as president. He really couldn't achieve anything, and ultimately ended up being, unfortunately, a forgettable one-term president. But did he achieve anything in the fight against slavery as president?
No, it was actually nothing really happened in regard to this. So during the campaign for president, he refused to comment publicly or privately about it. He refused to answer letters on the subject. He was very sensitive about not bringing it up to alienate certain voters, a certain block of voters. So the presidency of John Quincy Adams turns out to be really pretty much a disaster. Adams proposes this sweeping program of internal improvements that includes roads and canals, astronomical observatories, scientific explorations, uniform standard of weights and measures, a national university. All these things are fantastic things. But Adams stumbled here as well. He was not only met with opposition in Congress, but also the American people. So Adams's lack of political acumen at this time fails to sense that most Americans wanted less government. So he loses on that front as well. But the other thing in terms of slavery is that what's interesting here is that even though Adams's national improvement plans favored the developments of roads, canals, and harbors in the South, many of which would improve transportation of slave-grown products to market, Southerners always saw Adams as a harbinger of slavery's demise. Every action he took, they thought that he was trying to get rid of slavery. So by the time 1828 comes and he loses to Jackson, he's a defeated man, and he heads back to Quincy.
He heads back to Quincy as a defeated man, but this is not the end of his story. This is one of the only instances in political history, I think, where the president, after his presidency is over, still maintains high office and high standing in the political community. It's very rare to see, honestly. I know Obama commented and he said, after his presidency, he wants to sit on a beach somewhere drinking out of a coconut. The job of the presidency is extremely stressful. It ages you very, very much. And this didn't really apply to Quincy Adams here, because after his presidency, he plans on retiring a little bit in Quincy, like you mentioned, but ultimately comes back to public office in the House of Representatives, which is the only time in American history where a former president takes up a seat in the House. So walk me through how he eventually found himself in the House of Representatives.
So when he gets back to Quincy, his life is in kind of disarray. His financial affairs are not in order. He's still licking his wounds from the 1828 election. But Adams is not somebody who's going to be sitting around, looking out on his porch and watching the years go by. That is not what he does. So it's brought to his attention that there is an opening for a representative from the Plymouth district, and against Louisa's wishes, he decides to go for it, and he wins that seat, and now he is back in Congress. So now he enters the political arena once again, except this time in a different role.
Yeah, and I think it's here where he probably achieves, well, I shouldn't say that, because he did achieve a lot prior to the presidency, but as a representative in the House, he achieves much more than he did as president, that's for sure. But he was censured twice by Congress, which is interesting, condemned for his actions or his policies. What caused him to be censured by Congress?
Well, he becomes very, very outspoken about the slavery issue, and let me give you some background about what's going on, so you have a sense of the animosity between Adams and the slavery movement. So around 1835, the anti-slavery movement, which had been gaining ground, had kind of stalled. So abolitionists, especially Arthur Tappan out of New York and his colleagues, decide to inundate the country with anti-slavery literature. And this literature heads south. And you can only imagine what that must have been like when it reached some of those southern cities. So in Charleston, place goes crazy. Bags of mail are seized. In Baltimore, riots break out. In Mississippi, lynch mobs are hunting down blacks suspected of working with abolitionists. And even the Postmaster General said he will turn his head if abolitionist literature is blocked in order to preserve the social order of the South. So you've got large numbers of Northerners are fairly indifferent, and many are unsupportive of abolitionists. But the petitions revolving around the slave trade and slavery begin to mount. And so what happens is in 1836, Adams is presenting petitions, and objections are made to these petitions, and now it starts to get serious. And now Southerners are beginning to question the reception, even the reception of these petitions. So on the fourth particular time in 1836, Southerners felt that Adams had created such a degree of excitement that he was endangering the Union. So in May, there are several resolutions that are put out that are passed where all debate on slavery is cut off. And basically, Adams is gagged. He's not allowed to bring this up, and these are not going to be dealt with anymore. So that's the background. So in February of 1837, he presents a petition. He's not going to stop, by the way. He presents a petition purporting to come from slaves. Now, this is just unheard of. So Waddy Thompson of South Carolina accuses Adams of inciting a slave rebellion. So 3 resolutions are drawn up. So therefore, Adams should be censured for presenting a petition from slaves. And by doing this, he was basically what they called trifling with the House. So Adams has his chance to respond, though. So he dissects his opponent's positions, pounds away at slavery and the free speech issue, and he ultimately succeeds. And in the end, only 22 members vote for censure in the end. But Adams does pay a price for this because now death threats ensue. He begins to get letters, and pretty nasty letters, about he needs to stop what he's doing, but he doesn't. So that's the first one. The second one is just 10 times more explosive than the first one. So what happens in January of 1842, he continues to present petitions for the abolition of slavery, and then he does the bombshell. And this is one where he presents a petition from a bunch of petitioners from Haverhill, Mass, to, quote, peaceably dissolve the Union. Okay? So now Adams doesn't have any intention of doing that. But in the petition, it's basically saying that the resources of one section of the country, the North, is annually drained to sustain the views of another section, which is the South. So anyway, the House explodes. Resolutions of censure are drawn up. Both sides huddle to plan their strategy. And then Thomas Marshall of Kentucky, he's going to speak for the Southerners, and he can't believe that there are men wild enough to propose that the government should terminate its own existence. So Adams defends himself. He attacks slavery. He actually does a personal attack on Thomas Marshall, and Thomas Marshall is just left standing there. And he relates later that he felt that Adams' attack on him was a fate worse than death. I mean, it was just this brutal attack by Adams. So anyway, Adams's support is beginning to increase, and petitions are coming into Congress. They're flooding the House, and gradually this coalition of Southerners and some of their Northern allies begin to erode. And the other thing that Southerners figured out after this was all over, that allowing Adams to have the floor unfettered was a massive political miscalculation. Adams took full advantage of it. And Adams says, well, it's going to take me another week to finish my defense. John Botts of Virginia immediately moves to table the resolution against Adams, and it was over, and that was it. And so you can see from just those two things, and that's just two things, the level of animosity that's taking part on the floor of the House.
Yeah, it's incredible, despite his old age at this point, that he's still filled with so much vigor. It's kind of like Hamilton back in his day. He could take the floor and speak for hours, and this is kind of what John Quincy Adams is doing here in the House. I mean, when he stands up to speak, there's probably gonna be some people asleep by the end of it, just because he gives these speeches for so long. But what you mentioned earlier, the first point you made, was ultimately known as the gag rule, where the Congress was getting all of these petitions, especially from the abolitionist movement arising, and it got a little too overwhelming. So they instilled this gag rule that basically said that they wouldn't answer these petitions, and like you mentioned, Adams was vehemently against this and ultimately overturned this. But I kind of want to backtrack a little bit to the rise of the abolitionist movement and maybe how this ties into your title of your book, Reluctant Abolitionists, because it seems to me that Adams, his abolitionist points, he was sort of an abolitionist by association. Throughout his life, he never spoke publicly about abolition, very rarely privately, and it was during his time in the House that he was really urged to start speaking up about this from the abolitionist movement. So, what was his relationship with the abolitionist movement versus his own views on abolitionism? And is that maybe tied to the title of your book at all?
Yes, it is, as a matter of fact. So Adams's relationship to slavery is very complex. Adams is navigating a complex political scene. He remarks very early on in his diary that he's opposed to slavery and the slave trade, yet he remains silent for many years until he gets to the House. But the thing about his relationship to the abolitionist movement is that he is meeting with, dealing with, planning with a number of the key abolitionists of the day. And Adams considered their tactics bordering on dangerous. Okay, he found them lacking in political acumen. He thought they were out of step with how the human condition was to be improved. As a matter of fact, in his diary, Adams refers to them as inept zealots. That's his word. So for Adams, the process is important. And so politically, he can't go any further than what public opinion in the North and his constituency would tolerate. So if he goes too far, he'll not get reelected, and the cause of anti-slavery would be damaged for the long run. So although he never allied himself with abolitionists, in his diary, in his private notes, he does kind of admit he's an abolitionist, and but he does not publicly align with them at all. Now, they send him all these petitions, and he does bring them up in Congress, and that's where the title of the book comes in, Reluctant Abolitionist. He's reluctant to join them. He does a lot of their work for them, but he will not consider himself an abolitionist publicly because he doesn't think that's going to work out for him politically.
Another very important instance in his fight against slavery throughout his career was the Amistad affair. And it went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, the U.S. versus Amistad, which basically a brief footnote is slaves mutinied on a Spanish ship, and the question of their freedom was up in the air. And Steven Spielberg actually made a movie about this. I haven't seen it, but I hear Anthony Hopkins' portrayal as John Quincy Adams was masterful. So what exactly was the Amistad affair, U.S. versus Amistad? Adams took on this case as sort of a pro bono case to represent the slaves. So just walk me through this entire affair.
In June of 1839, these two men by the name of Jose Ruiz and Pedro Montes, they arrive at a Havana barracoon, which is a holding pen for slaves, to purchase slaves for work on the plantations on the northeast coast of Cuba. So they buy 49 adults and 4 kids, and they put them on the ship for transport. Now, important to remember that none of these captives spoke Spanish. They only spoke an obscure African language called Mendi. So it's important to remember this, that the passports are in false Spanish names. There's a description of each captive, but you'll see how this turns out. So on June 28th, they begin to set sail. And during the voyage, one of the Africans, called Cinque in Spanish, became concerned about the fate of himself and his companions. So, using sign language to communicate with the cook, he asks what's going to happen with the Africans. So, the cook indicates the Africans are to be killed by the Spaniards. So, Cinque, faced with the ultimate horror, has little choice but to execute a rebellion to get out of this. So, on the fourth day out, there's a rebellion. The captain and the cook are killed along with 2 crewmen, and Cinque and 2 other Africans take control of the ship. So at night, because the Africans are not familiar with navigation, the crew members that are sailing the ship keep sailing north, and the Africans want to sail east back towards Africa. Well, after a long meandering journey, they end up right off the coast of Montauk Point in Long Island. So the ship is captured, the cargo is seized, and they're taken into New London, Connecticut, and Cinque and all the others are charged with murder and piracy, and they're sent to jail in New Haven. So there's a trial in New Haven, and the captives in the district court are determined to be free men who are illegally kidnapped in Africa, transported to Cuba, and they should be free. So the district attorney appeals the decision, goes to the circuit court. Circuit court agrees with the district court, but the case is ultimately appealed to the Supreme Court, and this is where Adams enters. So Adams is asked to come on to the case by 2 important abolitionists of the time, Ellis Loring and Lewis Tappan. And they actually call on him at his Quincy home to actually bring him into the fold for the Amistad defense team. He'd been a consultant up to this point, but now he's asked to be assistant counsel to Roger Baldwin in defense of the Africans before the Supreme Court. So Adams, in his diary, he thinks that his infirmities are increasing and this is going to be his last great contribution to society, so, which is not true. So anyway, the Attorney General makes his case for why these slaves should be returned back to Spain. And then Roger Baldwin makes his case. He goes through all the nuts and bolts of the case. And then in February of 1841, it's now Adams's turn. So for 2 sessions, he goes right at it. He takes the slaveholders and the slave trade to task. He goes after the executive branch. He falls back on the Declaration of Independence as one of the most important things. And he says that, that one of the greatest violations of the oath of office is to cooperate with a foreign government to deliver a cargo of men under the guise of slaves and all this. And so Adams makes his case, and he basically shows that the blacks are free, the papers are null and void, they don't provide a title to property, and that the Africans should be free. So on March 9th, Justice Joseph Story delivers the verdict, and the Supreme Court decides in favor of the Africans, acknowledging that they had been transported and kidnapped illegally. So Adams's arguments actually helped win the freedom of the captives. Although it was a different take on things, it was very, very important. And so the Africans are brought back to Farmington, Connecticut, where they're provided housing, and eventually money is raised to outfit a ship, and the remaining survivors go back to Sierra Leone, and Adams becomes this big national sensation. So in return, this is kind of cool too, is Adams receives a Bible that's signed by several of the Africans. And he wrote this note, and it's a very soft note considering it's John Quincy Adams. And it was a side to him that you didn't really see too often, and it was rarely for public viewing, but he did have a real soft spot for these men.
Have you seen the movie?
Yes, I did. I've seen it twice.
Wow. So what did you think of it?
I thought the movie was fabulous. I thought Anthony Hopkins portrayed just an incredible John Quincy Adams. I thought he was fantastic. And like all movies, they alter the historical facts a little bit to make it good for viewing. But it really is a fantastic movie. You really get a sense of how brutal the slave trade really was.
One of the biggest issues at this time was Western expansion, like we mentioned earlier. And one of the biggest catalysts in this discussion was the annexation of Texas, which Adams fought against for years. Walk me through the annexation of Texas and why he was against it.
So Texas becomes independent in 1836, so it's its own republic. And so Adams gets wind that from his abolitionist friends that the United States is interested in annexing Texas to the United States. Now, Adams immediately doesn't like this because he sees that this territory is so big. He's actually told that it could turn into multiple slave states, and that this whole idea of slavery moving southwestward and expanding is not a good thing. And he spends 9 years fighting this. So, of course, on the floor of the House, he lays out the perils of the annexation of Texas. Americans getting involved in this is going to bring us into a war. And he spends so much time on the floor trying to find ways to stop this. So for Adams, it was basically a typical Adams. It's a criminal conspiracy engineered by Jackson and slaveholders in concert with Martin Van Buren, the president of the time, and members of the Northern Alliance. So Adams's speeches on the floor of the House are devastating. And so the annexation issue, for the time being, during the Van Buren administration, stalls because the Van Buren administration realized that the political price of acquiring Texas is no longer tenable because Adams is just ripping the whole thing apart. But unfortunately, when John Tyler becomes president, he begins meeting privately with Texan representatives to hammer out a treaty. And finally, in 1845, Texas is annexed to the United States. But Adams spent the good part of 8 or 9 years as one of the very few voices going against this. So it was quite a battle, and that was one that he lost for sure.
Well, ultimately, he was right about it leading to war, no, with the Mexican-American War?
Yes, he was right about a lot of things. He really was. He could see. He had great vision, I think, and I think that his ability to see into the future and what would happen if the slavery issue was not rectified, I think he was right on.
Yeah, he was a pretty prophetic individual. Saw the Civil War, saw the Mexican-American War. But looking back at John Quincy Adams in hindsight and looking at his career in its entirety and as a whole, what would you say is the legacy of John Quincy Adams?
I would say that it's mixed. I think that's a pretty objective way to put it. I would say that some felt when he was Secretary of State that he was too lenient in dealing with American slavery. Well, he rejected slavery outright. He also rejected anti-slavery positions that ignored a political solution or favored immediate abolition. For the first part of his life, his anti-slavery beliefs remain confined to his diary. A lot of his conversations are going on between he and his diary, and that's as far as they go. But after the revolution, I think that most of America is kind of being brought along with the principles of the Declaration of Independence, and equality of all members of society begins to grow. And even though Adams's presidency, which offers very, very few anti-slavery actions, his actions in Congress and his priorities on the improvement of the Union and the abolition of slavery begin to grow very important. I would say that Adams overall, he remains a giant of the first half of the 19th century for his part in the eventual eradication of slavery. And I would say he was a master of debate. He had outstanding parliamentary skills. He could marshal facts into a sound and logical argument, and it made him one of the greatest anti-slavery advocates of his time. And after he died in 1848, it's kind of what people are saying after he goes, that a little slow in the beginning. He's not really saying much when he should say things. And then eventually his actions in Congress really propel this along for the next generation, the Charles Sumners and the Abraham Lincolns.
And this fight and his political career would continue all the way to his moment of demise. He actually suffered a stroke or a heart attack. I believe it was a stroke while giving a speech on the floor of Congress, and it was 2 days later that he died in, I believe it was the Speaker of the House's office. But one of the people who got to see him before he died was a young statesman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. And as we know, Abraham Lincoln would go on to probably be the most important abolitionist in American history. And I'm curious to get your thoughts. Do you think seeing Adams on his deathbed as a young statesman and being able to see the legacy of abolitionism up close firsthand, do you think that had an impact on Lincoln, especially when it came to his fight against slavery?
Yes, I think it did have an impact. I think Adams had a huge impact on all those people. Now, when Adams died in 1848, Lincoln was just coming in for his congressional session. So Lincoln had known of Adams, all the things that go on in the papers, everything is published in the papers. So Lincoln knows what's going on with the different debates. There's a congressional newspaper. It's available for everybody. And he's seeing what is going on. And also, in terms of Lincoln, all the members of his future cabinet were also aware of everything that John Quincy Adams was doing. So I think Adams is impactful in terms of Lincoln carrying this through to fruition. But I also have to say, I think that without Adams, without his oratorical skills on the floor of the House, his ability to withstand, the punishment from Southern slaveholders on the House, excuse me, I don't think there was anybody else in Congress who could have stood up to Southern slaveholders like he did. I think it was difficult to do. He had the skills, and he took it as far as he could do it. And so now it was up to kind of the torches passed here, and now it's Lincoln's turn to take this slavery to its final deathbed.
Yeah, and not only to take the punishment, but also to give it back. I mean, he fought very hard. Like you said, he was a brilliant orator, yeah. And especially in cases like the Supreme Court and the defense of the slaves on the Amistad, very much so a very profound and important legacy in the fight against slavery. But I think that's a great place to wrap up. Jeff, I want to thank you so much for coming on again to American History Gazette. Like I said, unprecedented episode. Very first time I've had a guest return. But if you guys want to check out his book, John Quincy Adams, Reluctant Abolitionist, that's going to be in the link in the description. A nice photo of John Quincy Adams there on the cover. Actually, the first president to be photographed, I believe, which is pretty interesting. But Jeff, thank you for coming on.
All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.